And if it's Monday, it's Meet the Press Daily. Good evening. I'm Katie Tur in New York in for Chuck Todd. And we begin tonight with a series of brazen admissions by the president, followed by angry denials, all as impeachment pressure builds for Democrats. After seemingly confirming reports that he asked a foreign power to dig up dirt on his potential 2020 rival, Joe Biden, President Trump this morning only heightened speculation that he tied the prospect of foreign aid to those requests. Here he is yesterday at the White House and then this morning at the United Nations, telling reporters that he spoke to Ukraine about Joe Biden's, quote, corruption, and that he wouldn't give foreign aid to Ukraine if it wasn't rooting out, quote, corruption.
Conversation I had was largely congratulatory, was largely corruption, all of the corruption taking place, was largely the fact that we don't want our people, like Vice President Biden and his son, creating to the corruption already in the Ukraine.
What did you tell the Ukrainian president about Joe Biden and his son during your phone call?
Well, you're going to see, because what we are doing is we want honesty. It's very important to talk about corruption. If you don't talk about corruption, why would you give money to a country that you think is corrupt? One of the reasons the new president got elected is he was going to stop corruption. So it's very important that on occasion you speak to somebody about corruption. Very important.
And then after the president confirmed talking to Ukraine about Biden, came the denials about an explicit quid pro quo tied to foreign aid.
Did you tell the Ukrainian leader that they would have the aid only if they investigated Joe Biden and his family?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. I didn't do it. And I hope you're going to be able to see a call, because I didn't do it. Everybody's looking for that call. And keep going the way you're doing, because when you see the call, you're going to be very surprised. Now, when you see the call, if you see it, I hope you see it, frankly, you will find out that I did not do that at all. I did not make a statement that you have to do this or I'm not going to give you aid. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that.
Sir, you can authorize the release of the transcript. Will you do that,
I can
sir?
do it very easily, but I'd rather not do it from the standpoint of all of the other conversations I have. It was a very nice call. I hope you get to see it, and I hope you get to see it soon.
Democratic investigators want hard evidence, and they want it now. This afternoon, 3 House committee chairs threatened to subpoena Secretary of State Mike Pompeo if he does not start turning over documents related to the administration's apparent efforts to solicit Ukraine's help. Democrats are also demanding access to a whistleblower complaint reportedly involving the president's phone call with Ukraine. Some are demanding to hear the audio of the president's call if it does exist. Speaker Pelosi over the weekend threatened, quote, a whole new stage of the investigation if the administration does not hand over the complaint. And House Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff is now saying that Democrats may have crossed the Rubicon when it comes to impeachment. Most Republicans have either been silent or they're rather predictably backing the president. And perhaps lost amidst this craziness is the fact that there is no, I repeat, no hard evidence that Biden did anything wrong. Joining me now is one of the reporters who helped break this story open, Washington Post national security correspondent Shane Harris. Also with us is someone who knows her way around public corruption issues, MSNBC contributor and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. And with me on set is Jay Johnson, who was the Homeland Security Secretary during the last major scandal involving foreign election interference. He was also the Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York under, of all people, Rudy Giuliani. Shane, Joyce, and Jay, guys, welcome. Shane, you initially reported that there was a promise attached to this phone call. What more are we hearing about that? You heard the president denying it.
Right. Well, I think we're still trying to find out what all was said on the call. But importantly, what the Inspector General told Congress last week, the Intelligence Community Inspector General, who first fielded this complaint from the whistleblower, is that this person is alleging misbehavior involving more than one incident. So it's something clearly that goes beyond this phone call. And I think when we're kind of trying to get to the question of what is this promise or commitment that allegedly was made, I mean, one question we're trying to get at is it something that precedes or came after the phone call as well? But it's important to remember that it's apparently not just this one incident that's so alarm this intelligence official.
And just set me straight here, because I heard the president in one breath saying he hopes people see the phone call, that everybody's looking for the phone call. And then in another breath, he says, when asked whether he would declassify it, he says he's not sure in regards to other phone calls. What's he saying?
It's not entirely clear what he's saying. It is contradictory. I have no doubt that he's enjoying the way that this continues putting the spotlight back on Joe Biden as part of this. Maybe that's a nice side benefit to it. But, you know, if he were to release the transcript of the call, I mean, there are many people, I understand, who in the government who have seen this. It would potentially just sort of put to rest any question of whether there was a quid pro quo that was actually involved in this conversation. But again, it doesn't sound like the phone call is really the entire story here.
What is the magnitude of this, Jay? Put into perspective for us. The president calling a foreign country and talking about his political opponent in the next election.
Well, as you noted, I am a former federal prosecutor. It should go on my banner today. Under Rudy Giuliani, he hired me alongside Jim Comey, and I prosecuted public corruption cases. It is a federal crime to solicit or knowingly accept the assistance of a foreign government or a foreigner in a federal election. That's for starters. Second, I find it extraordinary that an American president would solicit a foreign government to investigate a private American citizen. That's not Lucetta, let alone the son of his leading political opponent. And so, you know, this, contrary to the nature of this administration, they ought to just produce the transcript.
So is there a question then that the president's trying to interfere in the next election? If he is talking to a foreign government about his political opponent in 2020, about something that he believes his son did where there's been no proof of any wrongdoing, does that in itself mean that he was trying to interfere in the 2020 election?
Well, we spent 2 years investigating whether or not there was collusion with the Russian government. Here, the president apparently directly solicited the Ukrainian government for what some would say assistance in the upcoming federal election. So one would argue there's the collusion, the conspiracy right there. The president himself is directly soliciting.
Is that impeachable?
That's a good question. That's up to the House of Representatives. I'm kind of where I think Speaker Pelosi is right now. We're kind of inside the election window, and at some point we have to leave this to the voters. But, you know, you never know. This president, things change day by day.
No doubt about that. We weren't talking about this a week ago. Joyce, the FBI, when you knew the FBI at least, what would they be doing under normal circumstances when it comes to Ukraine, Rudy Giuliani going over there? Of course, he's the president's lawyer, and Donald Trump.
You know, this is well within the FBI's bailiwick, and as the secretary knows, this is the sort of public corruption case they love best. Certainly, Southern District of New York, other U.S. attorneys' offices would have seen news reporting on not just this story, but on the Biden story, and would probably have been prompted to investigate. So perhaps one of the best guarantees, as you point out, that there's no evidence of wrongdoing by the Bidens is why did the president feel compelled to ask a foreign government to investigate? If there really was anything to these allegations, it would have been awfully easy to send the information as a referral to the FBI and have them look into it. As to the president's conduct, I think the FBI that I know and that Secretary Johnson worked for would have investigated this to determine whether there was anything to it. It is extraordinarily unusual that this almost ministerial task that the DNI had to refer the whistleblower's complaint over to the House Intelligence Committee once the Inspector General had made a decision that that complaint was both credible and urgent. The fact that that didn't happen like it should have is really a red flag. I suspect now what we'll see is a lot of dithering, a lot of slow walking. It's doubtful whether, if at all, that complaint will ever reach Congress. But someone needs to look into, and one hopes it would be the FBI and that it would be the FBI now, into whether anything improper has happened between this White House and others in an effort to obstruct the investigation into this whistleblower's complaint.
Well, let me read you what the Federal Election Commission chair said just a few months ago on June 13, 2019. Let me make something 100% clear to the American public and anyone running for public office. It is illegal for any person to solicit, accept, or receive anything of value from a foreign national in connection with a U.S. election. This is not a novel concept. I believe this comes right after the Mueller testimony talking about what happened with Russian interference in the 2016 election. Joyce, given that statement, how do you assess what the president is doing?
This is another one of the options. You know, we've talked a little bit about the bribery statute. It would certainly be something that you would want to investigate in this situation. The campaign finance violation is relatively clear, and you'll recall in the Mueller report, Katie, there were questions about whether or not the intent to violate the statute existed. Well, after having gone through the Mueller process, we are ironically here at a second moment where the president is alleged to have sought election aid, to have sought something of value from a foreign country in connection with the United States election. That's a federal felony. And now there can be no question that the president knew the consequences, understood the legal implications of that act. The problem is that we're running blind here, and I don't mean to imply that we, the public, are entitled to this information. Certainly the House Intelligence Committee is entitled to it. They need to have that basic complaint so they can understand what needs to be investigated and fulfill their Article 1 obligation under the Constitution to engage in oversight of this president. Because if he committed felony crimes, everyone has agreed, people who, early on favored impeachment, others who are more hesitant, that felony violations of criminal law by the president are high crimes and misdemeanors that need to be given a hard look for impeachment. If our process and accountability means everything, Congress needs to have that information so that they can move forward.
I think we can confidently say that the president has two strategies here. One, he doesn't believe that he can get caught doing anything wrong. He thinks he's invincible. I think we can say that from everything that has happened in the past 4 years. And two, it's the I'm rubber and you're glue strategy. Whatever you say to me, I'm going to throw back at you, and it'll stick to you. What we're now seeing, Jay, is that the president's own administration, his own cabinet secretaries, are doing this for him as well. Here's Pompeo and Mnuchin over the weekend.
Do you know why the president hasn't gone to the FBI about these allegations?
I don't. And I think the bigger story here is really what went on with Biden and his son. What I do find is inappropriate is the fact that Vice President Biden at the time's son did very significant business dealings in Ukraine. I, for one, find that to be concerning.
Well, I don't understand. So it's okay for Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump to do business all over the world. It's okay for Ivanka Trump to have copyrights approved all over the world while President Trump is president. But while Vice President Biden was vice president, his son shouldn't have been able to do business dealings?
Again, I don't really want to go into more of these details.
I do think if Vice President Biden behaved inappropriately, if he was protecting his son and intervened with the Ukrainian leadership in a way that was corrupt, I do think we need to get to the bottom of that.
If there was election interference that took place by the vice president, I think the American people deserve to know. And if it's the case that there was something going on with the president or his family that caused a conflict of interest, and Vice President Biden behaved in a way that was inconsistent with the way leaders ought to operate, I think the American people deserve to know that.
Jay, what do you think?
There was an excellent piece in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times laying out the facts of the Biden relationship to Ukraine, what the vice president did, what his son has done on the board of directors, and you really can't connect those dots like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Treasury tried to do. They clearly don't know what they're talking about.
Jay Johnson. Jay, good to see you as always. Shane, good to see you, and Joyce, you as well.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.